Hello folks, this is Alasdair Post-Quinn from Fallingblox Designs. You can find me online at double-knitting.com. This is the 5th episode of the Fallingblog Podcast. Thank you for your patience while I got this together. Without any further ado, let's get into the Fallingblox Report. Now, the Fallingblox Report from my last episode was about the survey. Now, the survey is long closed at this point. We had 216 responses. Thank you if you were among them. And I wanted to report this time on some results from the survey. This could get a little boring, I suppose, so feel free to skip it if it's not really of interest to you. So the first thing that I looked at was people's general feelings about virtual workshops. Of course, we're now at the hopefully tail end of COVID. And people are pretty zoomed out. People have been using Zoom a lot, and they're kind of tired of it. People are hoping that we're going to be getting into in-person workshops again. But there's definitely a lot of feeling that virtual workshops are still really good. People are excited to be able to take them from the comfort of their own home, and they're really happy about not having to pay as much for them as you typically have to for in-person workshops. Even if the workshop itself doesn't cost a lot, often getting there and staying there costs a lot of extra money on top of just, tuning in from your sofa. One other major takeaway from this question is that a lot of people found that the time of the workshops didn't work for them, either due to their own schedule or increasingly to their time zone, which I think is really excellent because it means I'm appealing to people around the world, not just in my own country and Canada and a bit in Europe, but I have people from Asia as well, Australia, places where the time zone difference is actually really kind of difficult to manage. So one of the things that people have been increasingly requesting is recording. So I'm looking into that. Next, I gathered interest from people on specific workshops that I already teach. All of the workshops that I currently teach got a hefty dose of interest from the 216-ish people who responded. There were a few who didn't vote on virtual workshops because they're not interested in taking virtual workshops, but the vast majority of people said they were interested, and the span of interest in the virtual workshops was pretty good. I think the most popular was the multicolor workshop at 116 responses. The least popular was my newest workshop, Marling with Double Knitting, and that had 47 responses. Still a good-sized showing. I also asked about workshops that I've thought about but haven't yet formulated. And I got even more interest here, and this makes a certain amount of sense because I figure a lot of the people who responded are people who have taken workshops with me before, so they may not have as much interest in workshops that I've already taught because they've already taken them. So the top two here, with over 120 responses each, were a workshop on shaping double knitting, which involves various types of increases, decreases, and short rows, and a workshop on troubleshooting double knitting. The least popular, still over 50 respondents, are advanced double knitting lace, so beyond the double knitting lace that I already teach, and double knitting in tarsia in the round, which is fairly specialized, but is also the technique that I use for the only double knit in tarsia piece that I have currently published, the Continuum hat. I also got some suggestions on project-based workshops or workshops on pattern design, which segues nicely into the next section. I've been teaching a multi-session workshop periodically for Stitches at Home, a show where a small group of students joins me for 3 or 5 sessions over the span of 2 adjacent weekends. This actually works really well for project-based stuff because it gives people work time between weekends. There was less interest in this style of workshop, but still over 40 responses for each. And the most popular here, with over 70 responses, was a workshop on double knit mittens. This is one that I'll be really excited to teach, but it's going to take some significant time to design and plan the workshop. The least popular ones of the multi-session workshops were the omnibus workshops, where you get the contents of 3 or 4 workshops in the space of 2 to 3 workshops. So it can be a savings if you're interested in all of the content that you'd be getting. Next, I gathered info on availability. Predictably, the slots that I use most frequently on Saturday and Sunday afternoons are still the most popular, but there's a significant showing, over 100 responses each, for weekday evenings, so I might start looking into doing more of those. These times are, of course, in Eastern Time, so adjust accordingly. The social media and online presence questions were also kind of telling. By far, most respondents don't interact with social media at all. Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest got around 100 responses in the never use column. The next most popular column was the periodically column, and in order of popularity there, the blog, my Instagram following, and Facebook were the best showings. Despite the fact that I make daily posts to Facebook and Instagram, fewer than 10 respondents said that they visit either of those daily, and fewer than 30 said daily or frequently. In retrospect, I probably should have asked about Ravelry too. The projects, books, patterns, videos, etc. were, of course, much more promising. These are deliverables, and I expect much more engagement with them. Predictably, the projects with the most interest were my patterns, my books, and my videos. The ones with the least interest were the newest ventures and the ones most likely to appeal perhaps to a younger demographic, my podcast, thank you for watching, and my Patreon. Some further comments indicate that people would be interested in having me put out more beginner and intermediate level patterns, rather than constantly pushing the boundaries, but there's still plenty of interest in the challenging patterns that I release. People still want printed books, especially if they're at least in part reference books, and the PDF download is always a plus. I got some feedback from the survey and some of my workshop surveys that people would really like and be willing to pay for an expanded version of the software that I use to teach my 2-pattern workshop. This is a piece of software that's been written for me by a friend, and if I'm going to start selling it, I really need to have a conversation with him first. There's a lot more to the responses in this survey, but I don't want to bore you any further. There are 3 major takeaways here. The first one is that I am going to start recording workshops. I've been avoiding doing this because of the cost of cloud storage, but I feel like one of the things that I can do here is that I can market the workshops a little bit differently. If everybody who enrolls in the workshop gets a copy of the recording or gets to view the recording for a certain amount of time, months most likely, then people could enroll in the workshop without any intention of actually showing up. This would deal with the time zone issue. If the workshop is not at a time that works for them, they can simply watch the recording afterwards. So I'm in the process of making some changes to my website to talk more about this, and when I announce my workshops for the coming fall season, I will definitely be making mention of this new perk. I'm also going to be reevaluating my social media presence and see what I can do to get more engagement there. And I'm going to start working on fleshing out some of the workshop ideas that people were most interested in, that I haven't yet taught, just to keep things fresh and interesting. So for those of you who took the survey, thank you so much for doing that. For those of you who didn't take the survey and would still like to add your name to workshop interest groups, there is a link below in the description of this video where you can click and sign up to be notified when a workshop that you're interested in taking is going to be running again. This is what's on my needles, and unfortunately right now what's on my needles is not very much that I can show you, not because it's secret, just because there isn't very much of it. One of the reasons that this podcast is so delayed is because I've been working feverishly on the Bocote hat, mostly just the pattern, not so much the actual knitting, because as the test knitters that I have working on it have found different things, not necessarily wrong, but unclear in the pattern, I've been writing and rewriting it, and recharting it, and recharting it, and recharting it. There are dozens and dozens of charts, and every time I do this, I have to mess with every single chart. I've gotten it to a point where it's really good now, but it's taken a lot of time, and it's left not very much time, especially among everything else that I'm doing right now in my life, to actually knit the thing. And I did start it, but I only got through one round of repeats before I realized that it was going to be way too big. And this is borne out by my test knitters' experiences as well. I owe them all an apology for making a pretty basic math error in the gauge, and unfortunately none of them caught it until it was too late. So I caught it and fixed it, but it also meant that the sample I was working on ended up too large. So I stopped it, and I'm starting again. So what I have right now is just this. It's one repeat of the Bocote hat, and you can see that I've got this sort of wood grain look and the knot holes that you may have seen in the last podcast. And it's one repeat too wide for my head size. So I've taken it off, held on to this much of it just so that I could show it off, and I'm going to redo it, and hopefully it'll be a little faster now that I've gotten used to the pattern. I'm also writing something into this pattern that I think people will appreciate. While it's a very complex pattern and has a lot of charts, once you get the rhythm of it, you can actually do a lot of this pattern without ever looking at the charts. There's a logic to the way it all fits together. And maybe that's something that I'm capable of doing and other people will struggle with, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how that's done in the pattern. So I've got one more piece to show, and it's something that is long off my needles, but not something that I've really shown before, because up until recently it has been something that I thought was going to be published in a book, and so it hasn't really been something that I could show. Now I find out that the book is either not going forward or not going forward with my piece, and I got the piece itself back as well as the rights back. So I'm going to be able to publish it, and I wanted to show off the piece. It doesn't have a name yet, but there are actually two of them. And the first one is just this cowl. It's a pretty basic zigzag sort of thing. I've done one like this, which is just, a cowl with a zigzag pattern done in the round. And then I did another one like this, which is a Moebius cowl. Now this one, of course, is not knit in the same direction. It's knit from the short edge rather than in the round. It's a short scarf that's stitched together, and where it's stitched together is right here. And, if I stretch it out, you can kind of see the seam, and you can definitely feel the seam. This is a piece with a couple of different variations in how it can be made. It is the first piece in a series of topological pieces that I want to release. And when the Wooshing 5 Elements collection is done, then I will hopefully start working on some of these. One of those things is another Moebius. This is what is called an extrinsic twist Moebius in terms of the twist is not part of the way it is worked. It's just made as a normal scarf, then twisted to assemble it. An intrinsic twist Moebius is something like the catboardy style of Moebius. There is something sort of in between those two that I figured out how to do, and I need to design it and knit it. It is a fascinating Moebius construction that I don't believe I've ever seen anyone else use. This pattern focus segment is going to be on something that I alluded to earlier on in the podcast while I was talking about workshops. I mentioned a workshop that I'm thinking about putting together on double knit mittens and double knit mitten construction. So I thought it would be fitting if I talked a little bit about the Ranelva mittens, which are mittens that I put out in Double or Nothing. Now, these mittens are interesting in a number of ways, but passed as prologue, and I thought it would be worth it to look at where they came from. So they're not the first mittens that I designed, but they are the first double knit mittens I designed. The first mittens I ever designed were these. And these are a stranded colorwork pair of mittens that I did for the Willow Colorwork Club many years ago. I don't remember exactly how long. I do have the rights back to these. I have yet to decide exactly what to do with them. I have to figure out whether I'm going to release them as a stranded colorwork pattern or redo them in double knitting. Regardless, I'm going to have to re-knit them because I don't have the sample anymore. I have very few photos of them even, and this one is one of the better ones I have. You can see in the photo that there's something unique about the thumb. In these mittens I use a thumb called the Eastern thumb, which follows the musculature of the hand with its increases, and creates a mitten which is symmetrical so that you can actually wear the same mitten as either right or left. Now before I did these mittens, I did another sort of prototype, and there's only one of these, which is sort of an extreme version of the Eastern thumb, starting all the way down at the opposite side of the wrist. This is another piece that I'd love to redesign at some point when I have the time. But you can see from the previous piece as well as this one that the Ranelva mittens also use a similar construction. Although rather than picking out the increases with a color change, here I'm hiding them a little bit within the rather busy colorwork pattern. But if you look closely, you can see that there are increases running down from the thumb gusset and into sort of the middle of the hand. There's another interesting thing that you can see, especially from this photo, in the shaping of the top of the mittens. Rather than being symmetrical, they actually sort of mimic the shape of a hand. You can see that my hand is not perfectly symmetrical. This finger is taller, and you can see that the same is true of the mittens. The decreases at the top of the mittens are not symmetrical either. And at the top of the mittens, I'm using something called no-brain Kitchener, which is a way of connecting two pieces of fabric with stitches that almost make it look like the fabric is continuous. In this case, the stitches actually worked out so that the pattern continues around the tip of the finger, which is a fascinating accident of design. The Ranelva mittens are currently available only in Double or Nothing, which is available in print as well as a digital version. Now, the last thing we're going to do in this podcast is the technique of the month. The technique of the month this month is reverse double knitting, which is a method of making purls on the outside of your double knit work. Combined with standard double knitting, this gives you textures, which forms the basis of my workshop on texture in double knitting. Reverse double knitting gets you purls on the outside of your work. As you can see, much of this piece has knits on the outside of it, as you would expect in any standard double knit piece. But there are two stripes that have purls. Now, one of the rules of double knitting is that every pair of stitches has a stitch order and a color order. The stitch order typically does not change. The color order frequently does. Here, we are changing the color order and the stitch order at the same time. So I'm going to start off by working up to the first color change, which is also a stitch change. In order to do standard double knit pairs, we knit the first stitch with both yarns in back and purl the second stitch with both yarns in front. Now, when we get to the color and stitch change, we now have a purl first and a knit second. Rather than simply bringing both yarns to the front and purling, and then bringing both yarns to the back and knitting, what we need to do here is actually separate our yarns. so that one goes to the front, available to purl, and one goes to the back, available to knit. For the span of the reverse double knit pairs done in purl knit, you simply purl with the color that is available to you at the front and knit with the one that's available to you at the back. In order to do BA pairs, you have to make sure that the B is at the front and the A is at the back. When you get back to standard double knit pairs, just return the 2 yarns to the back and continue as usual. And when you get to the next color end stitch change, again we're going to bring color B to the front so that it is positioned so that it can be purled with. And color A remains at the back where it can be knitted. If you have a long section of reverse double knitting, you'll find that it actually is considerably faster because you don't have to move your yarns back and forth in order to do it. This has been a video on reverse double knitting. If you're interested in more of this, check out my calendar of workshops and look for texture and double knitting. It's a workshop that I teach semi-regularly, and it will teach you all about these kinds of transitions, color, stitch, and vertically and horizontally as well. Thank you for watching the 5th episode of the Fallingblog Podcast with Alasdair Post-Quinn from Fallingblox Designs. I hope you found this podcast educational, enlightening, or at least entertaining, and I hope that you'll stick with me for the next one. If you haven't watched the others, check them out on my YouTube channel. If you're interested in supporting me in various ways, go check out my website. I have a store full of books and patterns and such, available in print as well as digitally. If you're interested in taking workshops with me, check out my calendar. If you're interested in getting deeper into my work, check out my Patreon. And hopefully, I will see you at some future date. Thank you very much, and stay tuned.